Well, thank you very much for your invitation, and it's it's a lovely occasion, and I feel sort of quite sentimental about being here. I used to work in this institution, had 2 very productive years here, and this is a subject area I do feel strongly about. As Mohan has pointed out, I do have a long association. It would be ludicrously pretentious to say that I know India. I don't. India, of course, is a vast place, and there are large parts of India I've never been to. But I did go over 50 years ago, and I've been going back regularly since as a economist and a politician and minister and as a business executive and, as you say, a son-in-law and most recently as a novelist. So I do have a interact on various levels. But I'm intrigued by the approach here, the kind of forward-looking attempt to think about scenarios and also to try to brand the relationship. My initial reaction is a little bit cynical because politicians are very good at reinventing the wheel. And I remember vividly one of the first week in the coalition cabinet back in 2010, David Cameron had this bright idea of getting some of the senior ministers in the government, which included George Osborne, William Hague, myself, and 1 or 2 others, and we were all directed to a jumbo jet and sent off to India to create what I think they called a winning partnership. I've forgotten what the slogan was, but it was something very, very similar. I'm not sure what there is to show for it, but it was a powerful statement of a potential relationship which we had neglected and needed to rebuild. But reflecting on it, I've always felt that the best place to start is not from history. I mean, clearly there is a historical link, a very strong one, between Britain and the Indian subcontinent, but it's obviously controversial and people have very different views about it, not all of them flattering about the role of the UK. So I think probably history isn't the best place to start. It's the best place to start with a combination of mutual respect and mutual interests. And, there clearly are mutual interests. I think the High Commissioner has spelt out very well what they are, and some surprisingly important ones, and some surprisingly unimportant ones. I had realised that British trade to India has fallen quite dramatically, at least in terms of goods, to almost to an embarrassing degree. But when you talk about investment flows, it's a very different story, and it isn't just that British companies form a major part of what is foreign investment in India, but equally very large flows of Indian investment in the UK. A lot of British people are still surprised when you tell them that our largest manufacturing company is Tata. I think that's still true even after the divestment of steel. But Indian companies it isn't just one big one, but a very, very large number of Indian investors are involved here in the manufacturing sector, in financial services and elsewhere, quite apart from the diaspora. So there are already very strong mutual interests. But in terms of the question you've posed, which is this interesting one about where will we be in 2030, I think it's important, I think, to get a sense of how quickly things are already moving. Before I became a Member of Parliament, I was in Shell's group planning. I was their chief economist, and we did scenario planning, which is a very good, disciplined way of thinking about the future, which is to say, what do we think will happen, but what do we think could happen, and to have plausible stories of the future. And when I was there, one of the scenarios that we played with was to ask to pose the question about the potential importance of the big emerging powers. And think that this was 25 years ago. And we did a thought experiment, which was to say, well, let's imagine a world in which over the next 25 years, i.e. to 2017, the rich world, America, Europe, Japan, continues to grow at about 2% a year, which is the historic norm, roughly. And let's imagine that the emerging markets economies, led by China, India, Brazil, then Russia, grow collectively by about 6% a year. Compound interest is a very powerful thing over 25 years. And what we anticipated as a result of that thought experiment is that in 2017, China would then have the biggest economy in the world, and India would be the third. And actually, that's where we are. Of course, it depends how you measure these things, but certainly in terms of purchasing power, China has now overtaken the United States in terms of size, and India is number 3. So it isn't a question of 2030. We're dealing with now, the reality of now. And I think the question for this discussion is what happens if we extrapolate forward another decade and a half and ask what will happen if something broadly like these trends continue. I'm not going to say a great deal about India. The people in the audience are much closer to that. But you can certainly envisage 2 very plausible stories about India, one of which is that the reforms that this government in India are putting through, they work. India's already at various stages in the last couple of decades grown at roughly 9%, I think 10% one year. And supposing that all gels and the Indian economy grows at 8-9% a year for the next 15 years. I mean, total transformation in living standards, lifting people out of poverty, and the sheer scale of the country. I mean, you could have a different story in which these reforms don't work, in which the economy nonetheless continues to expand, maybe 5%, something like that. It's troublesome because that's not fast enough to absorb all the young people coming through with population growth. But nonetheless, even somewhere between 5 and 9% a year, you still have an economy that's expanding very rapidly. And it's very difficult to, on almost any scenario of the future, to think of the UK or the other developed countries growing at anything remotely like that. So the disparity in size, economic size, is going to get bigger and bigger. And in 2030, it is very difficult to envisage a world in which China is any other than by far the largest economy in the world. And something could go wrong on these, you can't always extrapolate from the past. And that India will be very comfortably the 3rd largest economy in the world, which has massive implications for commodity markets, for patterns of trade, for flows of investment. So I won't try to say anything more about how India could evolve, that say the meeting can do that. But I would say a little bit about the UK, because I think we're unfortunately in a period of maximum uncertainty. I mean, Britain was a country where you may have liked it or disliked it, but you could be reasonably sure where you were. And now we're in a period of enormous uncertainty. Of course, the big question is around Brexit. I am probably one of the minority of people who believe it's still a question of if rather than when, but let's assume for the moment it does happen. Then there is big uncertainty about what form it takes. I mean, there are 2 broad views even within the cabinet, one of which is that I think is broadly the view of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor and the Business Secretary and others, I think I'm reading them correctly, which is that we should try to stay as close as possible to the European Union in terms of its trading arrangements and regulatory standards while actually leaving it. But there's another group who want to sever all links, or as many as possible, and have a very loose relationship, such of the kind that we currently have with countries like Canada. They're very, very different stories of the future and got very, very different implications. And they've got different implications in terms of how Britain sees its relationships with the rest of the world. And in terms of the relationship with the rest of the world, you can again envisage a whole variety of outcomes. I mean, if we'd had this discussion a year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago, I think we'd have all assumed that Britain was a pretty outward-looking place, and that may continue, but it may not. There is currently a high level of openness to investment, both financial flows and real fixed investment. I would think that probably continues, but we don't know. There is a growing anxiety about so-called security. legislation is coming for vetting of foreign investment on security grounds. I think it's mainly directed at China, but who knows? It could be part of a new approach to looking at things in a different way. Openness in relation to people is a very, very much more difficult question, because a lot of the people who voted for Brexit voted for it to keep people out, not to be inclusive and open. Whether that materializes, I don't know. I mean, I was involved in the campaign. I don't want to reopen all the debating points, but just as a matter of fact, a lot of the diaspora community voted Brexit because they were told there would be more visas. Whether that happens, we don't know. So there is an issue about degrees of openness, and it's already caused difficulties. I wasn't a fly on the wall in the meetings, the two meetings between Mrs. May and her opposite number in the last 18 months. But I'm told they were not good meetings. That the British said, can we have more access to your market for financial services and spirits and various other things? And the answer was, well, fine, providing we have more visas for students and skilled workers, to which the British answer was, well, sorry, we're not into that anymore, at which point the negotiations sort of ground to a halt. And I think that's where we are, but I'm not absolutely sure. So we don't know about openness. The other big uncertainty is, if we're looking ahead to 2030, what are the big things that the British will be doing? I mean, at the moment, you can identify certain areas where Britain has real areas of strength and competitiveness. Advanced manufacturing is one, notably aerospace. Financial services, certainly another. Creative industries, I think, another. It may be that in 15 years' time, we're dealing with the same combination of things, but advanced manufacturing is in some difficulty, and particularly the changes taking place in Europe will certainly have dramatic effects on the car industry and the aerospace industry. We can't predict. The financial services centre, I would imagine, will grow and flourish, whatever happens around Brexit, but again, we can't be completely sure. So I think the point I would want to make is that Britain is at a major historical juncture, and how we approach the rest of the world in terms of trade, investments, flows of people, is a big, big uncertainty. And I think anybody dealing with us will be painfully aware of that. Of course, there is a powerful school of thought in the opposition in the UK, which is summarised in the phrase socialism in one country. I mean, that may or may not materialise. I think it's unlikely, but there is a school of thought that that's where we ought to be heading. And there are other people who want to head in exactly the opposite direction and have a completely libertarian environment here. So anyway, the simple point is looking at the future, very, very, very uncertain. But that doesn't stop us thinking about it, building relationships. That's what we're here for. And I think there are a lot of very, very good relationships around business, universities, families, that we need to be developing. And whether we call it winning partnership or something else, I want to encourage it. So thank you for hearing me, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you for your remarks. And immigration, high school immigration will certainly be an issue to come for the next year. We have months and years to come, because I think that professionals here are looking forward to contributions there, and the issue of looking at high school migration skills both ways would be a... Thank you very much. Thanks for both of you to come here and to launch this initiative, and we hope we'll work with you for over the years for some of these issues on the bilateral between India and UK. Now this closes the first part of the panel. Please, could you come and sit there?